7 out of 10 seats in Britain, and this may come as a shock to some of you who regard the British system with its constituencies as a good thing, 7 out of 10 seats in Britain are safe seats. The person who holds that seat will almost certainly never actually lose it to another party. Reflect on this. In 4 of the past 5 general elections in Britain, fewer than 1 in 10 seats changed hands. Even in the great Labour landslide of 1997, only 3 out of 10 seats changed hands. In other words, 7 out of 10 were safe. A consequence of this is devastating for the centre-right, because it means that our legislature, who ought to be reining in big government, who ought to be saying to ministers, no, stop spending our money, stop trying to regulate us, stop trying to tell us how to live our lives. The legislature, which should have been counted upon to hold back big government, has been, in effect, in the pocket of big government. It has been asleep on the job. It has allowed through laws unchecked, unquestioned, because too often the representatives in Parliament are actually either acting as cheerleaders of the current government or as cheerleaders for the shadow executive. We have seen more arbitrary powers passed that simply shouldn't be passed unscrutinised and unchecked by the legislature. We've seen government increase what it spends as a percentage of GDP, because you cannot rely on ministers to rein in ministers. You cannot rely on a cabinet minister to go to cabinet and say to his colleagues, please, take away my budget, stop me from spending so much more. And it's because of this that successive governments, whether left or right, have seen government expenditure grow more and more. And this is because we've inherited a 19th century system of democracy, but when the fastest thing in the country was a horse, when it was necessary to elect somebody and send them off to a palace by the Thames and get them to make decisions on your behalf. But at the same time, in the past 20 or 30 years, we have abandoned the informal checks and conventions that prevented the abuse of executive power. So what do we do about it? How do we ensure that we rein in big government in Britain? Well, we need choice and competition to decide who actually stands, who gets to be an MP in the first place. Instead of having one-party fiefdoms where the party leaders have huge influence over who stands for the party, where the party machine it can be so important, we need a system of open primaries, so that every single person who lives in a constituency, and we must retain the constituency system, but every single person who lives in it must have a voice over who actually gets to be the Conservative or the Labour candidate in the first place. If it was good enough for Barack Obama to become President of the United States through open primary, we need that system, I think, to decide who gets to be a member of Parliament. Many people here will think, in Israel, we have this extraordinary proportional system. Well, I think both Israel with its proportional system and Britain with its safe seat system, we both suffer from the same thing, that too many of our politicians are in effect insulated from the voice and the views of the people. We don't have enough accountability to decide. It's the party machine that gets to decide who's on the list and in what order. I think we need a right of recall so that we can sack politicians mid-term. If you work in most areas of life, you can be called in by the boss on a Friday and fired if you're not up to it, if you allow standards to slip and you don't do what you said. Why should it be different for those in public office? We need a right of recall. Obviously, you need some checks and balances against vexatious attempts to remove people in public office. But actually, paradoxically, and game theory bears this out, if you allow people to trigger recall ballots against lawmakers who break their promises, guess what? Lawmakers tend not to break their promises. It tends to moderate the promises they make and make them make responsible promises. You'll get a more grown-up system of politics. I'm drawing comments to a conclusion. The third big thing we need is wiki politics, politics that allows the participation of the crowd. At the moment, deciding the laws that are framed is the almost exclusive preserve of professional full-time politicians, this class of politicians who work as full-time lawmakers. We need a right of popular initiative based on the New Zealand model, I think. And we need to go beyond that, allow ordinary people to have a direct say using the power of wiki sourcing to open source politics to allow people to directly participate and debate in and help draft and frame law. That is not to say that you allow people to write laws and pass legislation online. It is to say that you use the wisdom of crowds to give you a second opinion as a professional lawmaker as to what should and shouldn't be included in a bill. I digress briefly to say I've actually done an experiment on this, on a deregulation bill. I put up 23 proposed regulatory reforms, put it up onto Wikiversity, invited people through my blog to make suggestions, and I think at the last count we've got 157 proposed bits of law and regulation to repeal. Some of those 157 are clearly daft, but some of them are things that are actually incredibly good and wise, which in Westminster we could never have known about without the mass participation of people. I'll simply draw my comments to a conclusion by saying this. We're all familiar with the idea that the internet breaks down hierarchy. Whether you are in banking or selling books, the internet smashes hierarchy. It allows in new entrants. It removes the barriers to entry. It's going to do that to politics, and it's going to allow new entrants to come in. We're all, well, some of us may be familiar with the ideas of Clay Shirky and Chris Anderson in The Long Tail. They talk about the impact of the internet in various aspects of our lives. I think, reading Chris Anderson, it's striking that we have a society where there is an appetite for consumption that is distinctive, that is niche, that is particular. Well, I think there will be an appetite for politics that is distinctive and niche and particular. And the party systems, I think, will need to adjust to it. Edmund Burke used to talk of the little platoons. I think the internet is going to have a dramatic impact on reviving Edmund Burke's view of the world, because it will give those little platoons an enormous impetus. If you read what Edmund Burke was talking about and then read what Clay Shirky is talking about, I think you can see a sort of edmundburke.com type politics on its way. I just finished by saying this. The danger of direct democracy and of localism is pretty profound to the British left. I think I was talking at a conference of Fabians in Britain, and I think the impact of localism and direct democracy is an enormous threat to the status quo and to the British left. That is because the British left has, in effect, relied on the ideas and the positioning of the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci in order to get what they want. Antonio Gramsci understood that the left could not acquire through the ballot box what it wanted to achieve. And so he mapped out the idea of obtaining what the left in continental Europe wanted through capture of the institutions, a long march through the institutions. And if you look at Britain, Gramsci was pretty spot on. The left has captured the BBC, the universities, it has captured institution after institution, now has an inherently leftist outlook. If you make the institutions of the British state, the British Foreign Office, the BBC, the universities, the huge quangocracy that presides over us, directly accountable to the citizens, you recalibrate the settings of the British state away from the leftist approach they have today, back towards the mainstream, back towards the centre-right. Some of the smarter left grasp this, and they're beginning to see and fear it. Some of them don't. But I think it's a huge opportunity for the Conservatives. I think the impact of the internet will be enormous, and I think it provides a huge scope for a new sort of conservatism, and ultimately for a new relationship between the individual as a citizen and the state. I can barely imagine a world in which there wasn't an internet. I think it's a profoundly good invention. In fact, it's the best thing that's ever happened. Thank you.